Good evening. For those who don't know me, I am Paul Rosasco with Engineering Management Support, Inc. I'm a geologist, hydrogeologist, and a civil engineer who has worked on Superfund sites all over the country for nearly 40 years. At Lowry Landfill, I was responsible for the OU1 shallow groundwater and OU6 deep groundwater remedial investigation and feasibility study. I have also been responsible for various evaluations of the perimeter slurry wall, development of work plans to address issues raised by the 5-year reviews, preparation of the groundwater monitoring plan, and evaluations of the effectiveness of the north boundary barrier wall. Tonight, I would like to briefly describe one of the various evaluations we completed as part of the north boundary barrier wall containment system evaluation. That is particle tracking. Particle tracking is a tool that is used to simulate transport of contaminants that move with groundwater flow. It traces out groundwater flow paths. It does this by introducing particles into the flow field and allowing them to move according to the velocity distribution, which is calculated by the numerical model based on the hydraulic heads, that is the water levels, and the hydraulic conductivity values. We also used other methods, such as flow vectors, to evaluate directions of groundwater flow and chemical transport, but this presentation will focus on particle tracking. This slide was included in the prior video presentation made to the CAG on the results of the North Boundary Barrier Wall Containment System evaluation. It shows the velocity vectors for the alluvium and weathered Dawson formation after cessation of injection of potable water. Flow vectors are represented as arrows, with the larger arrows representing areas of higher groundwater flow, faster groundwater flow, and the smaller arrows representing areas of very slow groundwater flow. The light gray areas shown to the east and north of the north boundary barrier wall are areas where the numerical model predicts the weathered Dawson will be dry under steady state conditions. As can be seen on this figure, groundwater flow converges, that is, it flows towards the north boundary barrier wall and extraction well MW 170 EW1 from the south, from the west, and from the east. All of the arrows within the width of the 1,4-dioxane plume, which is defined by these red lines, are directed toward the north boundary barrier wall or extraction well MW 170 EW1. Very little movement of groundwater occurs north of the barrier wall because the barrier wall cuts off flow in this area, or to the south of the eastern portion of the barrier wall because hydraulic conductivity in this area is very low. This slide presents the results of the particle tracking simulations of groundwater flow approaching the north boundary barrier wall system from the upgradient site area for that same post-injection flow field. The tracks in this figure show that all the particles that start up gradient of the north boundary barrier wall, and in particular those within the limits of the 1,4-dioxane plume, move toward and are captured by the north boundary barrier wall system. To provide a sense of how the particles would move within the groundwater system over time, we prepared figures for various time steps. The gray lines represent the total particle tracks. The red portion of the lines represents the distance the particles would move during the particular time step shown on each slide. Note that on this figure, the particles have only moved part way towards the north boundary barrier wall or extraction well MW170 EW1. With more time, some of the particles reach the north boundary barrier wall. With additional time, even more particles reach the north boundary barrier wall. Please note that the absolute time shown on these slides, 3 months, 6 months, or in this case 1 year, or on the successive slides that I'm going to show you, are not that important. And they reflect the assumed effective porosity values used in the calculations. With a change in the effective porosity value, the particles could move faster or slower. What is important is that as the particles move within the groundwater system, all of the particles move towards and are ultimately removed by the north boundary barrier wall and extraction well MW170 EW1. With additional time, most of the particles that started to the south of the north boundary barrier wall have reached and been removed by the barrier wall system. Particles that started to the east still have not reached the extraction well. With even more time, all the particles that started south of the barrier wall have now reached the barrier wall and been removed by it. Again, it still takes longer for the particles to reach the extraction well, but with additional time they eventually do. The primary message to take from these slides is that all the particles present up gradient of the north boundary barrier wall eventually flow to and are removed by, that is, captured by the north boundary barrier wall system. In addition to particle tracking of groundwater transport within the alluvium weathered Dawson under post-cessation conditions, we also use particle tracking to evaluate chemical transport under a number of other groundwater flow conditions. This slide summarizes some of the additional evaluations that were performed using particle tracking that I will discuss in the next series of slides. For purposes of understanding these additional evaluations, we wanted to again show the particle tracks for the post-cessation conditions. So this is the same slide we showed a little earlier. Of particular note, to see some difference here between cessation, post-cessation and during the period of injection are some of the particle tracks between the barrier wall and well MW170 EW1. This slide shows the particle tracks for the pre-cessation conditions when potable water was being injected into these 3 wells. As I noted earlier, over on the east side of the barrier wall between the barrier wall and extraction well MW170 EW1, the particle tracks have changed slightly. They're now more direct movement towards the extraction well rather than coming up and then back over to the extraction well. It's about the only difference we notice between these two. Regardless, as with the post-cessation conditions, all the particles that started up gradient of the NBBW, and in particular the particles that start within the width of the 1,4-dioxane plume, move towards and are eventually captured by the north boundary barrier wall or the MW170 EW1 extraction well. Most of the evaluations we performed started with 50 particle tracks, 50 starting locations. This is the same slide we've been looking at for the post-cessation. We just blew it up a bit here. We also looked at some others. This slide shows what happens when we have 100 tracks. And although we get a lot more particle tracks, it still shows that they all flow towards, converge on the north boundary barrier wall system or into the extraction well MW170 EW1. Although most of our evaluations were based on particles that were started at the water table, we also looked at the effects of starting particles within each of the three model layers used to represent the saturated portion of the alluvium in Weather Dawson. This slide shows particle tracks started in the middle of the uppermost layer. So this would be close to the top but below the water table. This slide shows the particle tracks that were started in the middle of the Weather Dawson. Note that we don't see particles moving towards most of the eastern portion of the north boundary barrier wall, in this area here. That's because the Weather Dawson upgradient of the eastern portion of the north boundary barrier wall in this model layer 6, has a very low hydraulic conductivity. So particles started up gradient of this area don't move very far in the 50-year simulation period. This slide shows tracks for particles started within the lower portion of the Weather Dawson. Again, all the particle tracks move towards the north boundary barrier wall or the extraction well. And again, in the middle, in this particular layer, this is a very low conductivity material here, so the particles don't move at all in the 50-year simulation period. We also looked at the effects if we were to shut off groundwater extraction from MW170 EW1, EW-IW3, and MW113 EW1. All of the particles within the 1,4-dioxane plume up gradient of the north boundary barrier wall still move toward and are captured by the north boundary barrier wall. Some of the particles located to the east could move through the MW77 area and continue on and through to down gradient if the extraction wells were shut off. In conclusion, regardless of the number of particles used, where they were started vertically within the saturated zone, with or without the presence of injection of potable water, and with or without groundwater extraction, all of the particles that were started within the 1,4-dioxane plume up gradient of the north boundary barrier wall flow toward and are removed by the north boundary barrier wall or extraction well MW170 EW1. Thank you.